Matt Brown, Extra Points with us on 365 Sports. Matt, great to see you. Fantastic to see you with Craig Smoke, Paul Catalina, and also David Smoke. I read your story about Colorado and the assistant coach and the Saudi Arabian money. You did a, Freedom of Information Act and dug into all of that. What if all of that was the most interesting to you?
Oh, man. I feel like I have written maybe hundreds of NIL fundraising kind of stories over the last couple of years, and nothing about the Trevor Riley situation at Colorado is like anything else that I've ever done, right? Whether it's the initial pitch email coming Christmas Day, allegedly while the assistant coach was in Jordan on a different fundraising mission, whether it was the fact that he emailed ask@visitsaudi.com instead of going through a bank or a law firm or some kind of established intermediary, whether it was the pitch deck itself that was overwhelmingly centered on the Deion Sanders family tree rather than anything specific to Colorado football. There's just a lot. And I would say that based on the information that I obtained, I don't necessarily think anybody did anything illegal, but it is profoundly bizarre. And I am not surprised that Saudi Arabian interests, along with the university, declined to give $10 million to promote visiting Saudi Arabia through Instagram posts from Colorado football players. Don't think that's going to become typical.
So, like, the way that it was written and the way that he said it was like, I had this Saudi money lined up. It doesn't sound like he really did have Saudi money lined up. That Colorado didn't really drop the ball is that he went through the, 1-900-SaudiDollars.com kind of thing, right?
That's what the email pitch looks like. Now, I don't know who we talked to. I think he did go to Saudi Arabia. Maybe he ended up speaking to somebody at the staff there. I don't know about you gentlemen, but I sell ads, and sometimes if I'm trying to find somebody who I think would be a really good partner for Extra Points and I can't find their email address, have I sent that kind of email before? Sure. Have I sent it to a foreign investment fund of a potentially hostile foreign state? I have not. But I'm not going to fault somebody who's not a sales guy doing something that maybe professional salespeople would laugh at a little bit. But yeah, I think looking at the resignation letter, looking at the pitch deck that I was able to obtain, looking at that correspondence, it's hard for me to look at that and think, yeah, I bet this guy really did have $20 million lined up. Maybe this is just a particular red flag to me. When I hear somebody say, hey, I had secret Mormon connections and they had $3 trillion in that community, what I hear as somebody who spent almost all of his life a member of the LDS Church, I'm like, all right, I've met this dude before, and he says that there's a lot of things you could say there. Accurate would not be one of them. I don't think this is why Colorado's struggling.
Matt, what were your thoughts on the big realignment news last week? I mean, it felt like we were kind of into the season, and then all of a sudden here comes the Pac with the big headlines about the rebuild, and now we're starting to see all the shuffling going on, and there will obviously be more to come, but it seems sort of out of left field, and it sounds like it came together pretty quick, but just what were your thoughts on everything you saw and heard and what we're expecting now moving forward?
Yeah, I think I even wrote this a couple of weeks ago, that I expected realignment across the country to enter a slow period, in part because everyone was waiting on this situation to resolve, and from what I had been hearing from ADs and kind of industry people over the summer was, this is the possibility, but we think it happens in November. We think it happens in December. And what appears to have happened here is after negotiations about extending the Mountain West football scheduling agreement for another year fell apart over money, but this entire thing did come together within 4 or 5 days. And you can do that when you already have everybody's pitch deck. God knows Boise State's applied to the Pac-12 before. Kirk Schultz doesn't have to go deep into his filing cabinet to go find all of the television money information or the academic information about Boise and San Diego State and Fresno and Colorado State. I've been trying to get into new leagues for about as long as I've been a professional sports writer. I would expect there to be other news on this front potentially as early as the end of this week. There's a lot of I'm trying to think of the right word here. There is an interest and appetite on the Pac-12 side to figure out who's going to be in the boat as soon as they possibly can, because they think that will make their broadcast conversations much easier.
I have seen Memphis and Tulane as perhaps near the top. I've seen Air Force. We've seen other schools. Who would you guess will be next?
I don't want to guess.
Okay.
What I can say is that I knew prior to last week that both Memphis and Tulane had signed contracts with other third-party consulting services to help them with their pitches and to make them more attractive in the event that this exact sort of thing happened. Not necessarily that they were actively looking to leave the AAC, but knowing that, hey, something could happen in the next 2 to 6 months. Let's spend the money to preemptively be prepared because we do want to be involved when that happens. My understanding is that the remaining schools in the Pac-12 would like to be in the central time zone. So I think Memphis and Tulane are reasonable guesses or assumptions that those would be targets. I don't think that they'll be the only ones. I feel pretty confident in saying that if any of the other remaining Mountain West institutions were exceptionally attractive to those 6 in and of themselves, they would have been added already. Which isn't to say that they might not add UNLV or they might not add Air Force or potentially somebody else, but that there has to be horse trading or objections to overcome there on that front. If I'm the Mountain West, I think I'd be more concerned about Air Force leaving for the American than I would be about Air Force leaving for the Pac-12 right now.
How can they withstand it if they lose 2 or 3 more teams? Like what's gonna keep the Mountain West together if that does in fact happen?
That's a really good question. And if I was in charge of the Mountain West, I think the advice that I would give right now is if you can keep your core together right now, you still have the potential to be a very good basketball conference. And you should look at filling out the rest of your membership with that in mind. There are institutions in the WCC and in the WAC and in the Big West and in the Summit who would be more than happy to take that call. And to help you build a basketball league around New Mexico, around Utah State, around UNLV, and that can be a 3-bid plus league. It might still be a better basketball league than the Pac-12 right now, depending on who ends up staying on what rosters and who goes off to the portal. I think it's going to be very difficult to build a high-level football conference given who's left and who you're competing with, right? Like, do you want to go and use all of that exit fee money to go bring up the Montanas or South Dakota State and hope that you become a slightly better version of the MAC or a slightly better version of Conference USA? I think it's a tough ask when you realize how much more money you're going to have to spend annually for your athletic department, to say nothing of the $5 million to the NCAA and to say nothing about everything else to move up an FCS team. You could maybe get New Mexico State, maybe you can get UTEP. Does that really change anything like substantial? I don't think so. But I'm making that advice as somebody who doesn't have a Mountain West or a .edu email address and doesn't have the same political or financial pressures that they do. I know that Gloria is smart. I know they've got some smart presidents who are still in that league and that they're going to try to turn over every rock that they can. But I don't envy their situation right now.
Your thoughts about Air Force, who was just here over the weekend playing against Baylor, and now they could be headed, east to the American Conference?
But potentially, and I can understand certainly from the Pentagon brass about why there may be some value of having all the service academies together. Those are unique institutions and have unique commercial and financial value. Air Force is already traveling across the country. Like I was just talking to some people involved on their hockey side. They're already playing almost everybody in the Eastern time zone. The Air Force sponsors a gajillion sports. And I don't want to speak out of turn, but I do think that spending a lot of time in airplanes is part of the curriculum of this institution. So I suspect that's not going to be the deal breaker that it would be somewhere else. So this is, I think, a difficult conversation for them to ask, right? If we want to stay, knowing that we already have to park a bunch of our other sports in other leagues anyway, what is the Mountain West without these other 4 institutions? And does it make more sense for us to try to build something more oriented with Army and Navy? I would imagine the American has a compelling pitch to offer. What that pitch looks like if Tulane and Memphis leave, I don't know, right? Like I've got some notes. I got some some of the schools that I know the Americans kind of kicked the tires on over the last year. Where all of this ends up in 2 months after this round of musical chairs, it's hard for me to say who's the better league and who's not.
Matt, you had a comment I guess it was actually a couple of weeks ago that stood out to me about the Big 12 because there were rumors flying again, and you said As a reporter, I deeply appreciate the Big 12's commitment to providing content, to throwing out ideas to get people talking about the Big 12. I mean that unironically, but not every leaked big swing turns into stuff. That's okay. Just be careful, news consumers out there. This was, I guess, post-UConn rumors getting back out there, and they were connected to, I mean, they've been connected to everybody, kind of to what you're saying, and some of it's legit and some of it's not. And when it came to Wazoo and Oregon State, it was pretty clear the Big 12 just ultimately didn't have interest there. Have you just heard anything in general about the Big 12 that's not kind of what you're referring to and that has any meat on the bone, or is it all kind of just mostly talk in terms of what you've heard, I guess, here recently?
Yeah, and I want to maybe explain that tweet a little bit, because I don't think it's just all talk necessarily. One of the dirty little secrets about running a conference is that you often have conversations about potential schools all of the time. And those conversations might be with attorneys, they might be with consulting agencies, they might be with parties, that are removed from university presidents, but you're talking on a not irregular basis. And every time someone goes to NACDA, anytime someone goes to the NCAA convention or something somewhere, some president or some AD is going to take somebody aside in the hallway, and they might have an informal conversation. And most of those never become content. I don't find out about many of them, or if I do, it's a year and a half later, and then it's less news, or it never turns into anything. And what I have noticed out of the Big 12's administration right now, and I think this is more from the conference office than it is the individual institutions, is a willingness to leak and to share and to talk about some of those things. And I don't think that's dishonest or wrong. And I legitimately, for somebody like me, great. I want to hear all your ideas. I want to hear the dumb ideas. I want to hear the ideas that are in the early stages. I want to hear the stuff before you send out the press release, because you never know exactly what's going to stick. I think the initiative about wanting to be a bigger deal in Mexico is a great example of that. It is an interesting idea. It's one that makes a lot of sense, and one we've written about a couple of other ways. And I know that when the Big 12 was first talking about that, they got ahead of their skis a little about money and about realizing what it would take to buy out some of those conference home games and what the insurance is going to cost and getting passports for everybody. When you get in the weeds, you realize, okay, maybe we bit off a little bit more than we could chew. That's okay. That's how a lot of our businesses run too. We just don't typically send out press releases or call up Ross Dellinger when we're in the beginning of that thought process. Right. So, I mean, I would say, I think it's reasonable to assume that the Big 12 conference office is considering almost anything at any time, whether that's sponsorship deals, whether that's licensing deals, whether that's membership. It's not a secret that Yormark would love to be in New York, even if maybe here in Central Texas, we don't care about that all that much. What the schools want, different thing. So I'm not saying that the consumer should scream fake news anytime they hear anything about the Big 12 maybe doing something. It's all been legitimate as far as I'm aware. You just recognize that means a little bit different than if Greg Sankey said something like that, because he's not as willing to be as open in those kind of conversations. It's a different approach.
Well, and he doesn't have to go find every itch to scratch, right? Or every dollar to grab, right?
No, that's absolutely. I think you would want to have conference leadership that's willing to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall if you're not the Big Ten or the SEC. If you're trying to reclaim some different revenue channels or some different relevance or a different story. And I think it's going to be especially important this season, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but I imagine the narrative around this conference could change in a couple weeks if there's not two teams that clearly separate themselves as potential playoff candidates right now. We've had a couple of weeks into the season. Utah looks good, has some flaws. Kansas State looks good, has some flaws. Oklahoma State, same kind of thing. I don't know if anybody really projects two or three of those teams to make the playoff. And if it's late October and we've got every mock selection it's just Big Ten, just SEC, and one Big 12 team, would I be surprised if maybe that's when some more unique ideas start floating out of the conference office to get people talking about something different and not about West Virginia being 5-7? Sure. And you and I, we can wink and nod at that kind of thing, but that's the job of serving your constituents. And the job of that office is to get people talking about the Big 12, and shoot, we're doing it again right now. It's working.
We've talked about basically everything, Matt, but what's been played on the field with wins, although Washington State, we just had Jake Dickert on. What a great win for them. But anything, what is either a win or a performance or a loss or what, anything in particular jump off the page after 3 weeks of the season to you?
I mean, shoot. I mean, the biggest thing is probably how terrible Florida State looks. But I feel like maybe that storyline's been kind of beaten into the ground already. One that that maybe isn't as huge of a story, but I've noticed is I think Nebraska looks pretty good. And kind of the funny thing about Nebraska these past couple of years is even though their win-loss record has been not anywhere close to what anybody who was alive in the 90s would expect out of Nebraska, they weren't bad. They were just cosmically unlucky. Like no team would be like, we were top 35 in SP plus. We were efficient. We should have been an 8-5 team, and we managed to shoot ourselves in the foot in every fourth quarter and lose in hilarious ways. And you just have to imagine eventually there has to be some kind of regression. We'll know more this Friday, right? But I look at this and think this might be a year when the win-loss record starts to approach what they actually are a little bit better. I have thoroughly enjoyed making fun of Nebraska as much as everybody else on college football Twitter, but I think we should also recognize the reality. They might actually win 8-9 games this year, which after the Scott Frost era and everything else they've endured, good for them.
Yeah. Have you ever been to Memorial Stadium in Lincoln? I know you've traveled around the country, but have you ever been there?
I have not been there when there was a game. I've covered a women's volleyball game in Lincoln, which was an outstanding experience. And I've toured the stadium, but I haven't been there for a football game yet. And I hope I'd be able to do that at some point.
Craig and I are going on Friday. We're leaving after the high school game we have that night, getting up the next morning, flying into Omaha, and have a chance to enjoy that with Jennifer and Daniel, too. Matt, tell everybody how they can get this, because I have it in my inbox whenever it's sent out. Extra Points. This was a story about the Saudi Arabian money, the Colorado staffer, and that's just part of what you do with Extra Points in the newsletter.
It's just part of it. Tomorrow I have a reported story about what goes into having a live Bulldog mascot and how schools support the Bulldog's health and help people be effective there. I have some ticketing stories coming out. If you're interested in the story behind the story in college athletics, I think you'd really enjoy reading Extra Points. There's free and premium versions, but you can find it at extrapointsmb.com.
Absolutely. Matt, thank you, buddy. Appreciate it. Always great to have you on the show.
Thanks,
and
gentlemen.
Matt
Appreciate
Brown,
it.
Extra Points with us on 365 Sports.